Gauge blocks are a system for producing precision lengths. They are used in the calibration of measuring instruments and to measure the length of objects. They consist of a number of blocks of different lengths, where the arrangement of the blocks can produce block lengths with high precision. On each gauge block, there is a number that shows the value of its length. To produce a length whose value does not exist in one gauge block, the length is arranged by several gauge blocks into one. For example, a gauge block with a height of 16.862 mm is required. To determine the number and value of the gauge block array, the first gauge block is chosen with the value that represents the smallest decimal value, which is the third number after the point, which is 1.006 mm. Do not choose the first gauge block with the largest decimal value, as it will be very difficult to determine the length of the next gauge block. The second gauge block was chosen with a value of 1.32 mm. This value represents the value of the second decimal number after the point. The third gauge block is chosen with a value of 1.5 mm. The sum of the value of one digit after the point in the second and third gauge blocks represents the value of the first decimal number after the point. The fourth gauge block is selected with a value of 3 mm. The sum of the unit numbers in the first, second, third and fourth gauge blocks represents the unit numbers of the gauge block arrangement. The fifth gauge block is chosen with a value of 10 mm. This value represents the number of tens in the gauge block arrangement. The sum of the lengths of these 5 gauge blocks results in a height of 16.826 mm. Method for stacking gauge blocks or ringing. Prepare 2 gauge blocks to be stacked. To stack 2 thick gauge blocks, stick the 2 sides of the gauge block crossed. Then gently rotate until both faces are well attached. To stack thin gauge blocks, attach the thin gauge block face to the other end of the gauge block face. Then push the thin gauge block until both sides of the face are tightly attached. Clean the gauge block face before use. Apply an anti-rust coating after use for storage. One of the main functions of a gauge block is to calibrate other measuring instrument. A number of gauge blocks are selected to calibrate the reading value of a measuring instrument with the value listed on the gauge block. If there is a difference between the reading value of the measuring instrument and the value of the length of the gauge block, adjustments are made so that the reading value of the measuring instrument is the same as the gauge block.